You are standing in the cool, damp silence of a medieval city long after midnight. The air is heavy with the smells of smoke, wet stone, and something else, something acrid and sour. It seeps up from beneath the ground, through the grates and crevices of the cobblestones. Most citizens would never venture down there, not even during the day. But for a few men, this underground world was their place of work. They were called gong farmers. Gong, meaning dung, the men responsible for cleaning out the cesspits and privies of medieval towns. If the word sounds unpleasant, that's because their work was far worse. By day, medieval cities bustled with trade and noise. Merchants shouted from stalls. Smiths hammered metal, and the air smelled of fresh bread and coal smoke. But beneath the surface lay a different world entirely. Most homes and inns had privies, small latrine pits, either attached to the building or dug a short distance away. Human waste from the poorest, a beggar to the richest merchant, collected there for months, sometimes years. Rain didn't wash it away, there was no plumbing, and when those pits filled up, someone had to clean them. That someone was the gong farmer. They worked at night, when the city slept. The law required it. By royal order in places like London, gong farmers could not perform their duties during daylight hours, not because their work was secret, but because it was offensive. The stench alone could empty an entire street. So they laboured by torchlight and moonlight, carrying buckets and spades, climbing into the darkness of cesspits that had not been emptied in years. Imagine it. A narrow pit, often 6 or 8 feet deep, sometimes more. At the bottom, the mixture of human waste, animal remains, straw, and other refuse hardened in layers like sedimentary rock. The farmer would descend by rope or ladder, his face wrapped in cloth, his torch smoking as it fought for oxygen. He'd dig through the mass, filling wooden buckets with what was politely called night soil. Each bucket was hauled up and emptied into large barrels. These barrels were then loaded onto carts and taken outside the city walls. There, the contents were dumped into designated fields or sold as fertilizer to farmers. Yes, even in this era, nothing went to waste. Human excrement was a valuable resource. Still, the work was dangerous. The fumes, methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide built up in those closed spaces. Too much, and a torch could ignite them. Some farmers suffocated where they stood. Others collapsed from the gases, or slipped and drowned in the filth they were meant to clear. And yet, the job had to be done. The gong farmer earned more than many unskilled labourers, sometimes as much as 6 pence a day, several times the wage of a simple farmhand. But no amount of pay could buy social acceptance. Their smell followed them everywhere. The law forbade them from living within city walls. They were outcasts, relegated to the outskirts, along with butchers, tanners, and executioners, all trades necessary, yet unwanted. Still, they formed tight-knit communities. Many came from families of gong farmers, passing down the trade like a grim inheritance. Their tools were simple: shovels, iron rakes, buckets, ropes, and oilcloth garments if they could afford them. Otherwise, their clothes soaked up the stench until it became part of their skin. They slept in separate quarters, ate apart, and were avoided in church and marketplace alike. It is easy to imagine that such men were despised, but they were also essential. Without them, cities would have drowned in their own waste. Epidemics already swept through with terrifying regularity: typhoid, dysentery, and plague. Without the nightly work of the gong farmers, these outbreaks might have been far worse. Even so, records of their names are rare. The city rolls list their wages, but not their stories. Once in a while, a chronicler or magistrate mentions them, usually only when something went wrong. In 1320, for example, a gong farmer in York was fined for dumping his load too close to the city walls, fouling the river. In another case, a farmer in London was found dead in a cesspit, overcome by fumes. His fellow workers were forced to climb in and retrieve him. They worked quietly, efficiently, and without complaint. You can picture them, a group of men gathered at the edge of a dark alley, their cart creaking, their lanterns flickering against the walls. They speak little as they remove the boards covering a cesspit. One ties a rope around his waist, another steadies the ladder. The smell rises, thick and choking, but they are used to it. The first man descends. The bucket comes up full. Another follows, and another, until the cart begins to fill. Then they move on, their wheels rattling across cobblestone, leaving behind only silence and a pit ready to be filled again. By dawn, they have vanished. The city awakens to fresh air and sunlight, never realizing how close it came to suffocation. Yet even in their isolation, gong farmers occupied a strange space in society, despised, yet indispensable. They were not serfs, bound to the land. They were free men, often paid directly by the city or by private households. Some even grew wealthy, managing teams of laborers and contracting with towns for regular maintenance. A few owned land outside the walls, their modest success hidden beneath layers of filth and secrecy. And so, as the bells of the cathedral rang out across the rooftops each morning, the gong farmers disappeared into the countryside, their carts empty, their pockets heavier, their lungs filled with the scent of their trade. Few would ever thank them. But their work ensured that cities could breathe. Think of the paradox. A man reviled for doing what no one else would do, whose labor allowed everyone else to live in comfort. The medieval city was a living organism, and he was its cleaner, its silent caretaker of the unseen. But what became of these men when their work ended, when age stiffened their joints, or illness caught them in the dark? Records grow quiet again. They vanish from the rolls as suddenly as they appeared. Did they find peace in the countryside, or did they fade away, forgotten by the world they kept clean? And perhaps more curiously, if the gong farmers were the invisible guardians of the medieval night, what did their world truly look like down in the depths, where the walls closed in and the torchlight flickered against rivers of waste? What sounds filled that space? What secrets might have been buried beneath the streets, never to be seen again? The city above slept soundly, unaware of the slow work that went on below. It is easy to imagine the medieval night as quiet, but in truth, it was filled with its own particular rhythm. You might hear the faint echo of hooves on stone, the distant bark of a dog, or the drip of water through narrow channels carved centuries before. For the gong farmer, these sounds were company. They were reminders that life still moved somewhere above his head. The underworld of a medieval town was not a single connected sewer system like those of modern cities. It was instead a patchwork of cesspits, drains, and open channels, built at different times by different hands. The larger cities, like London, York, or Paris, were especially chaotic. Some pits were lined with stone or brick. Others were simply dug into the earth. In poorer neighborhoods, the walls crumbled and the waste seeped directly into the ground, poisoning the wells. Still, every house needed a place for its refuse, and every refuse pit eventually needed a man to clean it. When a gong farmer began his night's work, he did so according to a routine honed over years of practice. The first step was to locate the pits due for emptying. Householders paid the city, and the city paid the farmer. Sometimes, the farmer worked under contract, responsible for entire districts. In other cases, he moved pit to pit, knocking quietly at doors and collecting fees in person. There were ledgers, written in careful script, that recorded each site, the address, the depth, the date of the last cleaning. Bureaucracy, even then, had found its way into filth. The tools of his trade were as crude as they were necessary. Wooden buckets sealed with pitch, iron shovels, a rake with teeth worn down to nubs, thick ropes, often coated in tallow to resist rot, a simple lantern, its flame dim and smoky. And the most important of all, a sense of calm. Panic in a cesspit meant death. The gases alone could overcome a man in seconds if he breathed too deeply or swung his torch too near the walls. The experienced gong farmer learned to read the air the way the flame flickered. The faint taste of sulfur on his tongue, the sudden stillness before a pocket of gas released. Some wore wet rags over their mouths, believing it filtered the poison. Others relied on habit and luck. In this, they were much like miners, though instead of coal, they dug through layers of human waste. A new recruit might begin as a barrel boy, hauling full containers to the surface. It was grueling work. The barrels, when filled, could weigh nearly 100 pounds each. They were carried on shoulders or dragged by rope, then loaded onto two-wheeled carts. From there, they were trundled through the narrow alleys toward the city gates. Even at night, the stench was unbearable. People shut their windows and covered their faces as the gong farmers passed. The law required them to work after dark for that very reason. Those caught dumping waste illegally during daylight or inside the city faced fines or imprisonment. Yet, it happened often. Waste was expensive to move, and the temptation to pour it into a river or ditch was constant. In some cities, guards patrolled the bridges at night to stop nightmen from emptying barrels into the Thames or the Seine. But bribes and exhaustion made enforcement inconsistent, and so the rivers of medieval Europe became slow-moving carriers of the city's hidden labour. Out beyond the walls, the gong farmers found a different world: open fields, scattered huts, and the faint smell of tilled earth. Here, the waste was stored in large pits or spread thinly across farmland as fertilizer. It was called night soil, and though unpleasant, it was rich in nitrogen and valuable to growers. There was even trade in it: merchants who bought barrels from gong farmers and sold them on to farmers at profit. One man's refuse was another's livelihood. The gong farmer, then, existed within a peculiar economy. His work sat between cleanliness and decay, necessity and disgust. Without him, the city could not function, yet his presence reminded everyone of the filth beneath their civility. This contradiction defined his life. Occasionally, a gong farmer found something unexpected in the pits: a lost ring, a coin, a bit of jewelry. Such finds were rare, but when they happened, they were quietly kept. There were stories, half-believed rumors of men who discovered treasures thrown away in haste, hidden during raids, or lost during drunken nights. But for most, the only reward was their wage and the faint hope of a safer night's work. Still, there was a kind of rhythm to it. By the flicker of torches, men worked in quiet synchrony, shoveling, hauling, wiping sweat and filth from their faces. Above them, the city's narrow houses leaned together like sleeping giants. Sometimes, a window would open, and a face would appear curious, disgusted, or pitiful. The watchers rarely spoke. What could they say to the men who bore the city's waste on their backs? The church, too, had opinions about cleanliness. In sermons, priests spoke of physical filth as a metaphor for sin. To live, surrounded by dirt, was to be close to moral corruption. The gong farmer's very trade became a symbol, the cleaner of the city's sins. And yet, in a strange twist, he was often denied entry to church services. The smell, again, marked him as separate. His role was spiritual only by accident. As time went on, small reforms emerged. Some cities began building rudimentary public latrines connected to open drains that led to rivers. These were the ancestors of modern sewage systems, though crude by comparison. For the gong farmer, such changes brought both relief and risk: fewer cesspits to empty, but also fewer wages to earn. Technology, even then, threatened the hands that had long done the dirtiest work. But these changes came slowly, almost imperceptibly. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the gong farmer's world remained largely the same: a cycle of night, stench, and silence. The Black Death had swept through Europe a century before, killing millions. Many blamed the foul air, the miasma rising from unclean streets and overflowing pits. Cities responded by tightening sanitation laws. More work for the gong farmers, though also more danger. The plague did not discriminate, but it struck the poor hardest, and the poor lived closest to the waste. The gong farmers' labour, grim though it was, may have saved lives. By keeping the cesspits clear and the streets passable, he reduced the spread of disease more effectively than most physicians of his time. Yet, no statues were built for him. His heroism was invisible, buried under the city he kept alive. There's a strange kind of dignity in that. A man who spends his life in filth, yet provides the foundation for civilization. The philosopher might say that, without the gong farmer, there could be no cathedral, no marketplace, no palace feast. All depended on the unseen work of men who toiled where no one wanted to look. And when the night ended, their carts rolled back through the gates, past the watchmen, toward the outskirts. They washed their hands and faces in the river, though the smell never left. Then they slept while the city awoke, merchants shouting, bells ringing, the illusion of cleanliness restored for another day. For all their anonymity, the gong farmers left faint traces in the records. City archives mention payments for cleansing of the pits, the purchase of new cords and buckets, and the appointment of supervisors of the nightmen. Their wages, though meagre, were steady. In some places, they even formed small guilds, not official, but practical, sharing tools and knowledge, warning one another of dangerous sights, a brotherhood of necessity, bound by smell and survival. It is said that when one gong farmer died, his fellows would gather in silence at the edge of the city, their torches reflected in the water, and send him to rest with little ceremony. His clothes were burned, his tools passed on. Another man would take his place. City's waste never stopped, and neither could the work. Think for a moment of the world as they saw it. Walls slick with moisture, the distant trickle of water, the faint glimmer of torchlight on brick, the smell of ammonia and decay mingling with the scent of earth. A world few would ever enter willingly, yet one that existed beneath every step of medieval life. The gong farmers' city was not just London or York. It was everywhere from Paris to Prague, from Bruges to Florence. Wherever humans gathered in numbers, they left behind the same problem, and the same men to solve it. Civilization, it seemed, was built upon the labor of those hidden in darkness. By the late medieval period, whispers of reform began to grow louder. Engineers and scholars started to imagine a cleaner city, one that might one day do away with the need for such men. But change in those days moved slower than rot. For now, the gong farmer remained shovel in hand, breath shallow, eyes half closed against the stench, the keeper of the unseen. And one cannot help but wonder, as cities grew taller and richer, did any of their inhabitants ever truly think about the world beneath them? About the lives spent in shadow, making cleanliness possible for everyone else? Or perhaps it was better not to think about it at all, to let the memory of the nightmen fade with the sunrise, leaving only the faintest trace of their labor behind. By the dawn of the 16th century, the medieval world was changing. Trade expanded, cities swelled, and streets that had once been narrow lanes became crowded corridors of life and noise. But beneath it all, the same hidden network remained cesspits, drains, and ditches, carrying away the waste of tens of thousands of people. The gong farmer's work had not changed much in centuries. His shovel still scraped through layers of filth. His torch still flickered in the gloom, and his cart still rolled through the sleeping streets at night. Yet above him, the world was moving towards something new. The Renaissance brought with it ideas of order, cleanliness, and control. Scholars and architects began to see the city as a kind of body, one that could be made healthy or sick, depending on how its fluids flowed. Sanitation became an intellectual concern, not merely a practical one. But for the gong farmer, such ideas meant little. His was a world of buckets and barrels, of calloused hands and weary lungs. Theories about urban hygiene did not lighten his load. Still, slowly, his trade began to shift. The rise of the scavengers and rakers. By the early 1500s, some English towns began appointing men known as scavengers, public officials responsible for keeping streets clean of refuse. The word survives today, though its meaning has changed. The scavenger's duty overlapped with that of the gong farmer, but extended to sweeping and carting away all sorts of filth, manure, ashes, dead animals. The gong farmer continued to deal with human waste specifically, but now he worked under greater supervision. In London, the city's Court of Aldermen passed ordinances requiring cesspits to be emptied regularly. Penalties for illegal dumping increased. The city paid for wagons, horses, and tools to support the work. The gong farmer, once an isolated tradesman, became part of a municipal system, though not one that treated him with much respect. Those who worked in the night soil trade remained outcasts. They lived in the same quarters as tanners and butchers, near the rivers and moors where their loads were dumped. Children born into these families rarely escaped the trade. Their surnames Gong, Nightman, Dungate occasionally appear in parish registers, faint reminders of a profession too unclean for polite conversation. Even in official records, they were referred to indirectly. Those employed in the cleansing of the city pits, a tidy phrase for a filthy reality. The risks never faded. It is easy to think that, with time, their work grew safer, but in truth, the dangers remained. Methane explosions continued to claim lives well into the 17th century. A torch lowered too quickly, a spark against the wall, and the pit would erupt. Chronic exposure to toxic gases caused coughing fits, dizziness, and long-term lung ailments. Many gong farmers died young, their bodies weakened by years of inhaling fumes. And yet, the pay remained tempting. In some towns, a gong farmer could earn twice the wage of a mason or carpenter. During times of plague, when few dared to work, they earned even more. But wealth could not buy acceptance. No matter how full their purses, they were unwelcome in taverns, churches, or markets. To endure such a life required a kind of quiet pride, a belief that one's labour mattered, even if no one thanked you for it. Some gong farmers found dignity in the precision of their work, how cleanly a pit could be cleared, how efficiently a route could be run, how well the barrels could be sealed to prevent spillage. These were the small triumphs of a man who lived outside the city's graces, but within its needs. Hidden stories in the archives. If you leaf through the dusty account books of medieval and early modern towns, you can still find the faint traces of their existence. A payment recorded for night work, a fine levied for foul discharge near the bishop's gate, a purchase order for pitch to seal the gong barrels. These are not heroic tales, but they are the texture of daily life. Civilization is rarely built on glory. It is maintained through repetition, through the same motions, night after night, of men who labour where no one looks. In York, a record from 1502 lists a man named Thomas le Gongfamer, paid 8 shillings for cleaning the privy vaults of the Minster Close. It is one of the few instances where a gong farmer is mentioned by name. Thomas likely worked in the shadow of the great cathedral, cleaning the waste of priests and pilgrims alike. His world was one of grandeur above and filth below, a fitting image for the medieval age itself. A changing city. A fading trade. As the centuries passed, technology began to reshape the problem of waste. New drainage systems were built in the 1600s and 1700s, connecting houses to open sewers and, later, covered channels. These early systems were crude, but they reduced the need for individual cesspits. The gong farmer's job did not vanish overnight. In fact, the title, nightman, survived into the 19th century. In Georgian London, entire families still earned their living by emptying cesspools and privies. The tools were more refined, long-handled scoops, covered wagons, and iron-banded barrels, but the work was essentially the same. Even in 1858, during the infamous Great Stink of London, when the Thames reeked so badly that Parliament nearly fled the city, the descendants of the gong farmers were still at work. They were the last generation of Knight. Soilmen, cleaning, hauling, and disposing of waste in an age on the brink of sanitation revolution. It was not until the completion of Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system in the 1860 seconds that their trade truly ended. The great brick tunnels of Victorian London, stretching hundreds of miles beneath the city, carried away what had once been the gong farmer's burden. The Knight, soilmen, were no longer needed. Their disappearance went almost unnoticed. No monuments, no eulogies, just a new silence beneath the streets, the kind that comes when human hands are replaced by engineering. What they left behind. And yet, their legacy endures in ways we hardly recognize. Every modern flush of a toilet, every invisible network of pipes and drains, traces its lineage back to them. It was their grim labor that taught cities what happens when waste is ignored, when cesspits overflow, when rivers turn foul, when disease finds easy purchase in filth. Their work forced the first sanitation laws, inspired the first urban engineers, and laid the moral foundation for public health. In that sense, the gong farmer was both a relic of the past and a quiet architect of the future. Their world was not one of comfort or beauty. It was dark, heavy, and foul, but it was also deeply human, a reminder that civilization depends as much on its lowest labors as on its highest ideals. The builder of cathedrals and the cleaner of cesspits are bound by the same necessity. One constructs the glory of the city, the other preserves its life. The human side of filth. Imagine for a moment the last of the gong farmers, perhaps an old man in the early 1800s, his hair white, his lungs scarred from years of breathing the city's poison air. He stands by the river at dawn, watching a new sewer outlet being bricked into place. The younger men talk of progress, of pipes and pumps that will end the need for night soil. He listens, nods, and perhaps feels a strange mix of relief and loss. His work, despised though it was, gave him a place in the world. Without it, who is he? He walks home along the same path he has taken for decades. The cart tracks are familiar, though the smell of waste is fading. The city feels cleaner now, brighter, even, but for him, the silence is unsettling. Perhaps he wonders, as many workers throughout history have wondered when their trade disappears, will anyone remember what it took to build this cleanliness? Will anyone recall the nights of labor, the danger, the smell, or will the city forget the men who kept it alive in the dark? A reflection in still water. If you visit an old European city today, London, York, Paris, Prague, and you stand by the river at night, you might still sense something of their presence. The faint smell of damp earth, the whisper of water through ancient drains, the soft echo of footsteps that no longer belong to anyone. It is not the ghosts of kings or knights that linger there. It is the memory of the men who cleaned the world so that others might live in it. Their story is not glorious, but it is necessary. It reminds us that progress begins in uncelebrated places, in cellars, in pits, in the quiet hours before dawn. And it reminds us that history's true laborers are often those whose names we never learn. So, as you close your eyes and imagine the world of medieval cities, their stone walls, their crowded markets, their candlelit halls, remember also what lay beneath: the tunnels, The pits. The unseen rivers that carried away what no one wanted to see. The gong farmers are long gone, but their work continues transformed, mechanized, sanitized, in every hidden pipe and drain beneath our feet. Civilization still depends on its nightmen. Only now, they wear uniforms instead of rags, and their tools hum quietly instead of clattering in the dark. In the end, the gong farmer's legacy is simple yet profound. The idea that even the dirtiest work can serve the noblest purpose, keeping life itself clean and continuing. And so, beneath the sleeping city, the last torch flickers out. The air is quiet. The darkness, for once, is still. The work is done. But one question lingers, one that history rarely answers. When the light of dawn came, and the city above began to stir, did anyone ever pause to wonder who had labored through the night to make their morning bearable? Or did the world, as always, simply go on, leaving its keepers in shadow? It is dawn in the English countryside sometime around the year 1350. A pale mist clings to the ground, wrapping the reeds and willows in ghostly veils. The air smells of water, rot, and something faintly metallic. You stand ankle deep in the chill of a marsh, your boots filling slowly with muddy water. Around you, the wetland hums softly, frogs croak, insects buzz, and somewhere nearby, the slow ripple of movement disturbs the surface of the water. You are not here to fish or to farm. You are here to collect leeches. It is a strange occupation, both humble and important. The leech collector, sometimes called a leech gatherer, supplied one of medieval Europe's most prized medical resources. These small, writhing creatures, slippery as wet silk, were believed to hold the key to balance within the human body, a way to release bad blood, to cleanse the soul and flesh alike. For centuries, physicians and barbers alike relied on them. In monasteries, apothecaries, and battlefield tents, leeches were kept in jars and bowls, ready to be applied to the skin of patients suffering from fever, swelling, or melancholy. To modernize, the practice seems primitive, even grotesque. But in the Middle Ages, it was medicine. And behind that medicine stood a small army of collectors who waded into the cold, dangerous waters to find the creatures that would, in theory, heal the sick. The demand for bloodletting. To understand the leech collector's world, you must first understand the medicine of his time. Medieval healing was rooted in the ancient Greek theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on the balance of these fluids within the body. Too much blood, the physicians said, led to fevers, rashes, and even madness. The cure was simple: remove some blood. And while this could be done with a knife or a sharp glass cup, leeches were considered safer and more refined. They did not leave large wounds. They drew the blood gently and naturally. The belief spread across Europe. Kings, monks, peasants all might find themselves at some point with leeches clinging to their arms, necks, or temples. Thus arose the trade of the leech collector, a job without glamour, but with steady demand. Into the marshes, the leech collector's day began early, before the sun burned the mist away. He carried little with him: a wooden pail, a linen sack, and perhaps a long stick to steady his steps through the sucking mud. His clothing was simple wool or linen garments, already stained from years of work. If he was fortunate, he wore thick leather boots. If not, he went barefoot, for bare skin was sometimes part of the technique. In many parts of Europe, the English fens, the bogs of Ireland, the lowlands of France and Germany, leeches were plentiful. They preferred still, shallow water, often thick with reeds and algae. The collector would step carefully into the pool, moving slowly to avoid scaring them away. He knew the signs: the faint stirring near his feet, the flash of movement beneath the surface. And then he would stand still. The leeches sensed warmth and motion. Drawn to it, they attached themselves to his legs and feet, biting into the skin with their tiny, saw-like jaws. The collector would feel a sting, then a slow warmth as the blood began to flow. One leech, then another, until half a dozen hung from his skin. When enough had gathered, he would wade out of the water and gently remove them, sliding a fingernail beneath their bodies. They were dropped into a pail of damp moss or straw where they could survive the journey home. Some collectors carried small knives to scrape them off, though too much force could tear the leech and ruin it for sale. This was the ancient and painful rhythm of the leech trade, human blood exchanged for livelihood. The cost of the trade. The work was slow and exhausting. Each step risked sinking knee-deep into the mud, or stepping on something worse, a broken branch, a hidden stone, or a snake. The leeches themselves carried diseases, though this was not understood at the time. Their bites often became infected, leaving collectors with sores and scars. Repeated loss of blood led to weakness and dizziness. Yet, despite the dangers, entire families depended on the trade. Women often worked as leech collectors, especially in regions like Lincolnshire and East Anglia. Their small size and lighter steps made them ideal for wading in shallow water. Some worked independently, others were employed by apothecaries, who bought leeches by the jarful. A skilled collector could gather hundreds in a good week. They were kept alive in water-filled containers and sold to physicians, monasteries, or travelling barbers who practiced bloodletting in villages and fairs. The trade connected the remotest marshes to the heart of Europe's medical world. A peasant in the fens might collect leeches that eventually found their way into the hands of a royal surgeon in London or Paris. A commodity of life and suffering, leeches were delicate creatures. They had to be kept moist and cool, protected from the sun. Collectors often built small leech houses near their homes, shaded huts with earthen floors and large basins of water. Inside, the leeches swam slowly in jars, waiting to be sold or applied. Apothecaries prized them by size and activity. A fat, sluggish leech was worth little. A thin, lively one fetched a better price. Some collectors refreshed their stock by feeding them not with human blood, but with animal hides soaked in milk or diluted wine. Others simply caught more when their supply grew weak. In time, leeches became a currency of healing. They were prescribed for almost every ailment: fevers, headaches, gout, inflammation, even melancholy. Physicians carried them in small boxes, ready to attach them to a patient's skin and watch them drink. The sight was so common that few questioned it. For the collector, however, the process was not so clean. He dealt with the creatures in their rawest form, slimy, wriggling, uncooperative. The marsh water chilled his bones. The bites on his legs itched and festered. His feet, constantly soaked, cracked, and bled. The poet, William Wordsworth, writing centuries later, would describe a leech gatherer on the brand, lonely moor, a solitary figure, stooped with age, still wandering the marshes in search of his trade. The image was meant to evoke endurance and humility, and it captured the essence of a profession that had changed little over the centuries: the marketplace and the myth. In the bustling towns, the collector's work was hidden behind the clean facades of apothecaries' shops. There, jars of dark water lined the shelves, each holding the faint motion of life within. A customer might approach, describing a fever or a swelling, and the apothecary would reach into one of those jars with long fingers, withdrawing a glistening, coiling leech. The patient would not think of the marsh or the blood that had drawn it there. The connection between collector and cure was invisible. In some places, leeches were so vital that laws were passed to protect them. Certain marshes were declared royal preserves, and poaching leeches could bring heavy fines. Monasteries, too, kept their own stocks, tended by brothers who understood their care. The Benedictines, in particular, maintained ponds for leeches near their infirmaries. For all this reverence, the collectors themselves remained poor. Their work was seasonal, best in the summer, when the leeches were active and dependent on weather. A dry year could ruin them. Floods might sweep away their marshes entirely. And yet, like so many of the medieval world's hidden workers, they endured. They knew the land in ways others did not. The feel of mud underfoot, the shifting patterns of water, the subtle signs that marked where the leeches hid. Their knowledge, though uncelebrated, was a kind of wisdom born of necessity. Between science and superstition, to the medieval mind, leeches carried a curious duality. They were both miraculous and unsettling creatures that thrived on blood, yet could heal the sick. Some saw them as instruments of divine balance, others as symbols of sin and excess. Preachers warned that a man who drank too much of the world was like a leech that never let go. Still, no sermon could diminish their practical use. In the age before microscopes and germ theory, medicine was built on symbolism and experience. A leech's gentle extraction of blood seemed merciful compared to the sharp blade of a barber's knife. And so, for centuries, they remained indispensable. But in the quiet marshes, none of this mattered. The collector's task was simple: find them, catch them, keep them alive. The world's beliefs and theories could rise and fall. The leech, ancient and patient, continued to feed. As the sun climbs higher, the mist begins to fade. The collector, his legs streaked with blood, lifts his pail heavy with writhing life. He makes his way back toward the dry land, each step squelching in the mud. Behind him, the water ripples once more, closing over the places where he stood. He will rest, clean his wounds, and prepare his leeches for market. Tomorrow, he will return, for the marsh never truly empties, and the need for leeches never ends. But as he walks, a quiet thought lingers in his mind, one that haunts all those who live by such labour. How much of his own blood has he left behind in the service of others' healing? And in the end, will the leeches take more from him than he ever earned from them? By the mid-14th century, the leech collector had become part of a larger machine, the growing commerce of medicine that linked peasant labour to the wealth of towns and courts. The trade in leeches was not merely a matter of survival. For those who gathered them from the wetlands, it was an economy unto itself, shaped by geography, superstition, and the changing demands of a world that believed illness could be drained away. If you were to walk through a medieval town market, you would smell the iron tang of blood and herbs long before you saw it. Between the stalls selling onions, wool, and salted fish, there would be the apothecary's stand, a canopy of glass jars, powders, and dried plants. And among the remedies displayed, one might notice the jars of dark, shifting water. Inside them, leeches. They clung to the glass, slow and deliberate, their bodies flexing like ribbons of shadow. To most townspeople, they were mysterious creatures, half medicine, half monster. But to physicians and barbers, they were instruments of precision. The leech, after all, was no ordinary worm. The trade expands. By the 1400s, leeches were a fixture of European medicine from London to Florence. The demand for them grew as universities trained more physicians and as towns built hospitals. Barbers, who often performed minor surgeries, advertised their skill in bloodletting as both science and art. Their red and white striped poles symbolized the intertwining of blood and bandages, of flesh and healing. In cities like Paris, Venice, and Bruges, leeches arrived in bulk shipments. Collectors from rural areas sold their catch to middlemen, who carried the jars along trade routes, much like merchants carried spices or wine. The best specimens were packed carefully in moss, sealed with waxed cloth, and stored in cool places during the journey. The marshes of England, France, and the Low Countries were famous for their leech populations. But even these could not keep up with the growing demand. Merchants began importing them from Scandinavia, Poland, and as far east as the Ottoman lands, where the wetlands teemed with what they called healing worms of the East. It was, quite literally, a business built on blood, human and otherwise. Handling and curing. The leeches. When the leeches reached their destination, they were kept in special containers, leech jars, often made of glazed ceramic, with narrow necks to prevent escape. Apothecaries filled them with clean, cold water, sometimes laced with a bit of salt to keep the creatures lively. The jars were kept in cool rooms, away from sunlight, where the leeches could survive for months. Every few weeks, they were refreshed. This process involved feeding them a delicate operation performed with animal blood, or sometimes with the apothecary's own arm. The leeches that fed too often grew sluggish. Those left too long without food became weak and useless. Maintaining the balance required patience and care. In wealthier establishments, leeches were even graded by size and temperament. Small, active ones were considered ideal for treating children or delicate patients. Larger, more aggressive leeches were used on robust adults or for deep fevers. Physicians kept meticulous records of how much blood was taken, how long the leeches were left on the skin, and whether the patient improved. It was, in its way, an early form of controlled dosage, centuries before the concept of modern pharmacology. The collector's share. Back in the countryside, the leech collectors remained at the bottom of this hierarchy. Their world was still the same: mud, cold, and the slow rhythm of the marsh. Yet even their simple work had begun to change. Wealthier apothecaries sometimes hired collectors directly, providing them with tools or paying them in advance for a season's worth of harvest. Some villages formed cooperatives, where families worked together and shared profits. But most collectors continued, as before, poor, isolated, and anonymous. Payment was inconsistent. In good years, a bucketful of strong leeches might bring enough coin to feed a family for a week. In bad years, the same bucket fetched little. Leeches that died before sale were worthless. A heavy rain could flood the ponds, washing away entire colonies. And when the weather grew cold, collectors sometimes had to break thin ice to reach the water below. It was not uncommon for a collector to collapse from exhaustion or blood loss during a long day in the marshes. The fainting, the pale lips, the trembling hands, all were part of the trade. Yet, there was a strange pride in the work too. Collectors understood their value, even if society did not. Without them, the physician's shelves would be empty, and the barber's basins dry. The patient's perspective. If you were a patient in the 15th century, suffering from fever or headache, the treatment you might receive would depend on your station in life. A nobleman could afford the services of a trained physician. He would be seated in a comfortable chamber, his pulse examined, his humours discussed. The physician would consult his charts, perhaps draw a horoscope to determine the most auspicious moment for the procedure, and finally, produce a small, polished jar. Inside, a handful of leeches waited. The physician would apply them carefully to the skin, often behind the ears, on the neck, or at the temples. Within moments, the leeches would attach themselves, their tiny jaws working rhythmically. Each one could drink several times, its own weight in blood. The patient would sit quietly, sometimes for an hour or more, until the physician decided enough blood had been drawn. Then the leeches were removed by sprinkling them with salt, or by heating the skin slightly to make them release. The wounds were cleaned and bandaged, and the leeches, if still alive, were placed back in the jar to be used again after some time. For the poor, the process was rougher. A barber surgeon might perform it in a back room or even in the street, charging a few pennies. The leeches were reused far too often, and hygiene was poor. Infections were common. Yet the practice continued, because people believed in it. To bleed was to purify, to release not only sickness, but sin, the hidden costs of healing. Behind this system of medical belief lay a quiet tragedy. The marshlands that supplied Europe's leeches were being drained and reclaimed for agriculture. Fields replaced wetlands, and villages expanded into the collectors' territories. The balance between human need and nature's rhythm began to tilt. By the 1600s, the leech populations in Western Europe were declining. Collectors had to travel farther and farther to find them. The few remaining wetlands became fiercely guarded, sometimes violently so. Stories spread of collectors fighting over access to ponds or sabotaging each other's traps. Leeches themselves became harder to catch. Overharvesting thinned their numbers, and pollution from nearby settlements changed the water's chemistry. What had once been a reliable, if unpleasant, livelihood became precarious. Yet the demand for leeches did not wane. Physicians continued to prescribe them for every ailment imaginable, from nosebleeds to insanity. In the background, the collectors grew poorer. Some abandoned the trade entirely, turning to peat cutting or fishing. Others persisted, clinging to the only skill they knew, a world built on small lives. There is something almost poetic about the contrast between the world of the physician and that of the collector. One dealt in theories, charts, and fine Latin phrases. The other dealt in mud, pain, and blood. Yet they depended utterly on one another. Without the collectors, there were no leeches. Without leeches, the physician's authority faltered, and without the patients anxious, faithful, desperate, neither had purpose. In that sense, the leech was a symbol of medieval society itself, hierarchical, interconnected, and sustained by invisible labour. You might imagine, on a quiet night in the marsh, a collector standing motionless in the water, waiting for the faint pull of a leech against his skin. Somewhere, miles away, a candle burns in an apothecary's shop, casting light on a jar of dark liquid where other leeches float. The same creatures, separated by distance and class, join two worlds, the peasant and the physician, the muddy and the learned, toward decline and change. By the dawn of Renaissance, murmurs of change had begun to stir in medicine. New ideas from scholars and anatomists challenged the old humoral theories. The human body, once seen as a vessel of fluids and balances, was slowly being reimagined as a system of organs and functions. Still, the leech endured, even as printing presses spread knowledge and universities grew. The sight of a physician with a leech jar remained common. The trade adapted, more organized, more profitable for those higher up the chain, but still harsh for those at the bottom. And as Europe moved toward the modern age, the marshes and the people who depended on them faced a slow disappearance. The collector's world was fading, though he did not yet know it. He still rose before dawn, waded into the water, and filled his pail. He still sold his catch in the market, his hands chapped and cold, but the world around him was shifting. Towns growing, doctors questioning, wetlands shrinking. The leech, once seen as nature's physician, was on the brink of becoming an anachronism. And yet, even centuries later, humanity would find itself returning to the same humble creature in modern hospitals, in sterile rooms, used again for microsurgery and wound healing. It seems that the leech, like the collector, could never quite be drained away. But before that future could arrive, the collector still had one more trial to face the age of overreach. When Europe's thirst for bloodletting became a frenzy, a question lingers. When healing becomes obsession, what happens to those who supply it? It is the early 19th century now. The world has changed beyond what any medieval leech collector could have imagined. Steam engines crawl across the landscape. Railways carve through the old wetlands. Cities expand, their air thick with smoke. And yet, in the quiet backwaters and ponds of England, France, and Russia, one ancient trade still endures the collecting of leeches. For centuries, this small, uncelebrated profession had persisted, adapting slowly to each new era. But now, as Europe's fascination with bloodletting reached its feverish peak, the leech collector found himself in unexpected demand. Physicians prescribed leeches for nearly everything from headaches and gout to childbirth and cholera. The old theories of humours lingered stubbornly, even as modern science began to rise. Doctors ordered leeches by the thousands. Hospitals stocked barrels of them. Apothecaries competed to secure new supplies. And deep in the countryside, the collectors, men, women, and children alike, returned to the marshes in droves. It was, at last, a time of profit, but also a time of ruin. The Great Leech Craze. In France, during the 1,820 seconds and 1,830 seconds, the craze for leeches became almost absurd. Parisian hospitals alone were said to use more than 5 million leeches a year. Wealthy patients demanded them for the smallest discomforts. Even Napoleon's surgeons had carried jars of them into battle. Doctors believed that nearly every illness came from an excess of blood. The logic was simple. If the patient suffered, the blood must be impure or overabundant. And so, the remedy was always the same. Let the blood flow out. This philosophy had ancient roots, reaching back to Galen and Hippocrates. But in the 19th century, it took on industrial proportions. Governments sponsored leech imports. Traders crossed borders carrying barrels of the creatures packed in damp moss. Entire networks of supply stretched from Russia's bogs to the pharmacies of London and Vienna. Leeches became so valuable that smuggling rings emerged. Some collectors even faced imprisonment for harvesting in restricted wetlands. In England's Lincolnshire Fens, families who had gathered leeches for generations found themselves swept up in a frenzy. Merchants came, offering higher prices, pushing them to overharvest. Children were sent into the water to wade barefoot, their thin legs ideal for attracting the creatures. It was dangerous work. The marshes were treacherous, the water thick with silt and decay. Leeches clung in dozens to their skin, feeding until their bodies swelled dark and round. When the collectors stumbled back to shore, weak from blood loss, they peeled them off and dropped them into their buckets. A strange exchange of life for coin. The slow collapse. But nature, as always, had its limits. By mid-century, the wetlands of Europe were nearly emptied. Overharvesting, pollution, and the drainage of swamps for farmland destroyed the leech's habitat. Collectors who had once filled their pails in an hour now struggled to find a handful in a day. The prices rose sharply. Apothecaries complained of shortages. Physicians began to reuse leeches again and again, ignoring the risks of infection. In France, the situation became so desperate that the government launched leech farms, artificial ponds designed to breed them. But the process was slow. A single leech could take months to mature, and breeding them required clean, undisturbed water. Few farms succeeded. The irony was cruel. A creature once despised as a parasite had become a victim of human appetite. For the collectors, the consequences were devastating. Their livelihoods evaporated along with the marshes. Many drifted to nearby towns, taking work in factories or as labourers on the new railways. The knowledge they carried, how to read the movement of the reeds, how to find the leeches by the way water quivered, vanished with them. By the late 1800s, only a few professional leech gatherers remained. In parts of Russia and Finland, where the wetlands still stretched wide and wild, the trade survived a little longer. But even there, the collectors spoke of thinner catches and dying ponds. The end of bloodletting. As the leech trade collapsed, medicine itself began to change. The same century that had driven Europe into leech mania also gave birth to modern physiology, to microscopes, antiseptics, and the discovery of bacteria. Doctors began to realize that disease came not from bad humors, but from infection, poor hygiene, and unseen organisms. Bloodletting, once the foundation of healing, began to look like a dangerous superstition. The medical journals that had once praised it now called it ineffective, even harmful. By the early 20th century, leeches were relegated to obscurity, a medical curiosity, a remnant of a darker age. But in the quiet villages, old people still remembered. They remembered their mothers standing knee-deep in the water, their hands red and cold, the leeches writhing in pails. They remembered the smell of the marsh, the hum of insects, the sound of wet footsteps through the reeds. It was not glory they recalled, but endurance, a small, stubborn survival that had kept them alive in a world that barely noticed them. The marshes fall silent. When the great drainage projects swept across Europe in the 19th century, the marshes disappeared almost overnight. In England, the vast fens, once an endless expanse of mist and water, were turned into farmland. Ditches replaced pools. The old pathways vanished under soil and stone. The leech collectors were among the last to leave. They watched as their ponds dried and their trade withered. Some refused to go, insisting that the leeches would come back. Others took to catching eels, cutting reeds, or guiding travellers through the remaining wetlands. But the sound of their footsteps in the mud, the faint splash of a pail being lowered into the water, those sounds faded. The marsh grew quiet, and with it, a certain kind of knowledge, patient, unrecorded, humble, slipped away too. A strange return. Centuries later, the world found itself calling once more upon the leech. In the late 20th century, surgeons rediscovered the creature's usefulness in medicine, not as a tool of superstition, but as a marvel of biology. Its saliva, rich in anticoagulants, allowed blood to flow freely through damaged veins. In reconstructive surgery, where tissues risked dying from clotted blood, leeches proved life-saving. Hospitals, sterile and modern, began keeping leeches again. Not in muddy pails, but in refrigerated glass jars. The leech collector, long vanished, was replaced by laboratory technicians and biologists. It was as if history itself had drawn a slow, circular breath. What remains? If you walk today through the remnants of the Old English fens or the French marshes, you might still find traces of that vanished world. A half-sunken wooden post, perhaps, where a collector once tied his horse. The faint depression of a leech pond, reclaimed by grass. A rusted pail, its bottom eaten through by time. The leeches themselves are harder to find. In some protected wetlands, they survive silent witnesses to centuries of human ambition and ignorance. They feed, rest, and wait, indifferent to the rise and fall of civilization. It is strange to think that such a small creature shaped so much of our medical history. Yet perhaps the most remarkable thing about the leech collector's world is not the blood or the mud, but the patience. To stand in still water for hours, waiting for a tiny movement beneath the surface that was a discipline few could master. It demanded endurance, silence, and a kind of humility before nature. Reflection. In the end, the story of the leech collector is the story of all forgotten labor. Those who supplied the materials of healing, whether herbs, minerals, or the creatures of the swamp, rarely found their names recorded in history. But their work sustained empires, kings, and commoners alike. They endured discomfort and danger so that others might be healed. They gave their blood, literally, so that the world's physicians could continue their art. And though the marshes have dried and the collectors are gone, their legacy remains not in monuments or books, but in the quiet persistence of the leech itself, still doing what it has always done. When you close your eyes, you might picture it: a grey dawn, a pale mist, the faint rustle of reeds, a lone figure wading into cold water, still and waiting, the circle of ripples spreading slowly outward. The world around him may change, but the stillness, the patience, and the quiet work endure. The marshes may be silent now, but beneath their still waters, history still breathes. It begins with a creak, a sound of timber and iron, slow and steady, echoing through a high, dim chamber. The year is 1820, and you are standing inside the yard of a British prison. The air smells of damp stone and sweat. Above you looms a great wooden contraption, a treadwheel, or, as it was sometimes called, the ever-turning wheel. A dozen men are inside it, side by side, climbing what seems to be an endless staircase of wooden steps. Their striped uniforms cling to their backs, soaked with sweat. Their feet rise and fall in the same rhythm. Hour after hour, the sound, the groaning of wood, the dull thud of boots, the clinking of chains fills the air like the heartbeat of the place itself. This is not a machine of industry, nor of war. It is a machine of punishment. The birth of the treadwheel. The treadwheel was the invention of a man named Sir William Cubitt, an English engineer, best known for his work in civil construction. In 1818, he proposed a device that would keep idle prisoners busy while also producing useful labor. His reasoning was practical and moral. Prisons in early 19th century Britain were overcrowded and chaotic. The system of punishment was shifting from public spectacle hangings, floggings, pillories, to a new philosophy: reformation through discipline. Instead of watching criminals suffer in the town square, society now preferred that they suffer privately, productively, and silently behind walls. Cubitt's machine seemed perfect for this new age. It was both a tool and a symbol, a way to extract labor from convicts while breaking their will. The first wheels were installed in Bury St Edmunds Jail in 1819. From there, the idea spread rapidly. By 1824, nearly every major British prison had one. Each treadwheel was massive. A wooden cylinder, up to 20 feet in diameter, divided into sections like the blades of a paddle wheel. The prisoners stood on the outer edge of the steps, gripping a horizontal bar for balance. As they climbed, the wheel turned slowly, forcing them upward, while gravity pulled them down. The effect was that of walking up an endless flight of stairs that led nowhere. And for many, that was precisely the point. Labor without purpose. Unlike the mills of industry, the prison treadwheel rarely powered anything of value. In some places, it was connected to a millstone or a water pump, grinding grain or raising water for the prison. But more often, it turned nothing at all. Its motion dissipated into sand or air, producing no output but exhaustion. The intent was discipline through futility. The endless climbing, the ache of the legs, the monotony, all were meant to humble and reform. Each man would spend 6 to 10 hours a day on the wheel, divided into intervals of 15 minutes walking and 5 minutes rest. That might not sound unbearable until you realize what it means to climb a step every second for hours. Prisoners were said to ascend the equivalent of 5,000 to 14,000 feet per day, nearly the height of a small mountain. Some wheels held as many as 24 men, side by side. Silence was enforced. Talking or turning one's head could bring punishment. The men's only companions were the rhythmic creak of the machine and the sound of their own breathing. At the end of the shift, they were drenched in sweat, their legs trembling, their hands raw from gripping the bar. The philosophy of pain. To understand why such a device existed, you must step inside the mind of the early Victorian reformer. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain, cities expanding, factories rising, wealth for some, and misery for many. With progress came anxiety about order, morality, and labor. If the working man could build an empire through discipline and toil, then perhaps the criminal could be redeemed the same way, through controlled, meaningless work. The treadwheel embodied that logic perfectly. It was mechanical yet moral, punishing yet respectable. It inflicted suffering without bloodshed, and thus satisfied both public conscience and administrative need. For reformers, the treadwheel was a triumph of rational punishment, no longer the chaos of the stocks or the cruelty of the lash, but something scientific, regulated, and continuous. For prisoners, it was slow torture. A day on the wheel. Imagine waking before dawn in your cold cell. The bell rings. You are given a small breakfast, a lump of bread, a bowl of gruel. Then, the guard's voice echoes down the corridor. To the wheel. You march out in silence, chains clinking, through the narrow yard. The wheel stands before you, looming in the grey light. The air inside is damp, the boards slick with sweat from the day before. You take your place on the step. The officer calls out, "Walk." The wheel begins to move. At first, it is easy enough, a steady rhythm, one step, another, but the wheel does not stop. The rhythm becomes a climb. Your calves burn, your knees ache, your back tightens. You dare not falter. If you miss a step, you might fall forward into the man below, earning a shout from the guard or a lash from his whip. Minutes stretch into hours. Time loses shape. You count your steps without knowing why. The only change comes when the officer calls, "Rest." You step aside, gasping, for 5 minutes, then climb again. By midday, the room stinks of sweat and fatigue. Some men cry quietly. Others mutter prayers. A few, numb from exhaustion, move as if in trance. At day's end, when the final bell rings, you stumble back to your cell. Your legs throb. Your stomach growls. You lie on the straw mattress and close your eyes. But the motion does not stop. In your mind, the wheel keeps turning. And tomorrow, it will begin again. The silent machines of Britain. By the 1830 seconds, there were over 50 treadwheels operating in British prisons, from London's Coldbath Fields to the hulking fortress of Brixton. Each was slightly different in design, but the principle was the same. Some turned millstones to grind corn. Others pumped water for the prison's own use. But many, as records show, were deliberately left unconnected, their motion serving no purpose but punishment. The prison wardens measured progress not by productivity, but by obedience. A well-conducted wheel produced silence and submission. A noisy or rebellious one brought flogging, solitary, the confinement, or reduced rations. Even women's prisons had smaller treadwheels, often disguised as laundry machinery. In truth, the same endless motion awaited them. The official reports described the machines in practical terms: durable, efficient, easy to regulate. But behind these tidy words lay a reality of monotony so extreme that some men went mad. The critics speak. Not everyone admired Cubitt's invention. Humanitarians and writers began to question whether such labor truly reformed the soul or simply destroyed the body. In 1824, the journalist James Neild called the treadwheel a machine of despair. Others described it as grinding men's hearts instead of corn. Charles Dickens, who visited prisons for his research, later wrote of the treadwheel as the treadmill of society, where the poor toil and the world forgets them. But official opinion was slow to change. To the administrators, the wheel was neat, measurable, and morally sound. It kept the prisoners quiet and cost little to maintain. The suffering it caused was invisible and therefore tolerable. Between machine and man, the treadwheel marked a peculiar moment in history when punishment and industry merged. In earlier centuries, labor had been redemptive. In later ones, it would be productive. But here, in the narrow window of the 19th century, it was neither. It was motion without meaning, discipline without result. The prisoner was no longer whipped, nor publicly shamed. He was simply made to turn. For hours each day, he became a living gear in a system designed not to kill, but to wear down, the body reduced to mechanism, the soul to silence. And yet, some historians note, the treadwheel also offered a strange form of equality. On the wheel, all prisoners were the same thieves, debtors, poachers, beggars stripped of identity, united by motion. The wheel did not care who you were. only that you kept climbing as the century turned. The treadwheel would begin to face its own reckoning, challenged by reformers, displaced by machines that truly worked, and haunted by the ghosts of those who had walked its endless path. But that reckoning was still to come. For now, the wheel turns on hour after hour, day after day, an empire powered, in its own small way, by human feet. When you think of the Industrial Revolution, you imagine roaring furnaces, spinning looms, and men in soot-covered caps engines of progress, moving Britain into a new age. But here, in the prisons of the same era, another kind of engine was turning, a quieter one that produced not wealth, but obedience. The treadwheel, once hailed as an innovation of moral engineering, became something more, a symbol of how deeply the 19th century believed in order through repetition, the architecture of punishment. To understand the treadwheel's purpose, you must see the space it occupied. Prisons, before the 1800s, were chaotic places, jails mixed men, women, debtors, and murderers alike. There were no uniforms, no schedules, and little sanitation. The reform movement of the early 19th century changed that. Reformers such as Jeremy Bentham, with his concept of the panopticon, proposed that punishment should be rational, efficient, and morally improving. Every movement of the prisoner should be visible, measurable, and controllable. The treadwheel fit this philosophy with uncanny precision. Each wheel was placed in a separate chamber or yard, enclosed by high walls. Observation slits allowed guards to watch unseen. In some prisons, multiple treadwheels were arranged in rows, each isolated by partitions, preventing communication between prisoners, but allowing supervision from a central point. You can imagine the sound: dozens of men climbing in silence, their steps muffled by wooden boards, the air heavy with the smell of damp fabric and iron dust. Above it all, the steady creak, a kind of mechanical heartbeat for the institution. Every turn of the wheel was recorded. Guards noted who faltered, who complained, who tried to rest before time. In some prisons, charts were kept, not of production, but of endurance. The system was elegant, if you measured elegance by control. The mathematics of misery. The treadwheel was not arbitrary in its cruelty. It was designed to be quantifiable. A typical prisoner at Coldbath Fields would climb 12,000 vertical feet a day, roughly the height of the Himalayas' lower slopes. The rate of rotation was fixed, often around 24 steps per minute. The wheel's dimensions, number of prisoners, and working hours were calculated so that the machine could operate continuously throughout the day. It was, in essence, the application of industrial precision to human suffering. The prison regime was built on schedules: 5:30 a.m., wake-up bell; 6 a.m., morning meal, bread and gruel; 6:30 a.m. to noon, treadwheel, labor, divided into 15-minute work intervals and 5-minute rests. Noon, midday meal, often boiled potatoes or broth; 1 p.m. to 6 p.m. Return to the wheel, 6:30 p.m., lockdown in cells. This was the rhythm of correction. No variety, no choice, no conversation. Even the guards followed strict timing. A bell rang to signal every change. Silence was absolute. Prisoners were forbidden to speak, to hum, or even to look sideways at their neighbors. The wheel, it was said, taught men to hold their tongues as well as their tempers. The faces of the wheel. If you look through old prison records, the names of the men who walked the wheels blur together. Most were poor laborers, vagrants, thieves, poachers. Few had education or trade. In Coldbath Fields, one of London's most notorious prisons, the wheel workers included a chimney sweep who had stolen coal, a tailor's apprentice caught picking pockets, and a sailor convicted of desertion. For the educated public, these men were the refuse of society, the idle and immoral. But inside the prison, they were the workforce of a grim industrial experiment. One former prisoner, known only as T.L., left a description in a letter smuggled to his family in 1836. The wheel goes round without end. We climb as though to heaven, but remain in hell. My knees shake so that I cannot stand when released. Some cry for mercy, but mercy here has no sound. Another wrote, anonymously, "The man next to me fell. He had missed his step, and the wheel carried him under. He rose again bloodied, but said nothing, for to speak was forbidden. Their words rarely reached beyond the prison walls. Silence, after all, was part of the punishment. The wheel abroad, Britain's empire, was vast, and its institutions followed the flag. The treadwheel appeared in Ireland, India, Australia, and the Caribbean, installed in colonial prisons and workhouses. In Sydney's Carter Barracks, convicts walked a wheel to grind corn for the settlement. In Kingston, Jamaica, enslaved labourers who resisted plantation discipline were sometimes sent to the prison wheel, their idleness corrected by British engineering. The export of the treadwheel mirrored the export of empire itself. Control through routine, punishment through labour, and belief in progress through pain. Even in colonies where machinery was scarce, the idea of the wheel persisted. The belief that the body could be reformed by motion, that discipline could be measured in revolutions per minute, breaking the silence. By the 1840 seconds, however, cracks began to appear, not in the wheels themselves, but in the moral machinery that justified them. Reports from prison inspectors revealed alarming rates of illness, injury, and insanity among wheel prisoners. Knees swelled, ankles gave out, and men fainted mid-step. The monotony, some said, was worse than the pain. Doctors warned that the lack of purpose in the work was breaking men's minds. In 1842, Reverend John Field, a chaplain at Reading Gaol, wrote in his report, "The labour is not only unproductive but destructive. It neither teaches skill nor fosters virtue. It wears down the body, and with it, the soul." Public opinion began to shift. The Victorian appetite for useful suffering was waning. The industrial age had moved on to new forms of productivity. Railways, telegraphs, mechanized factories, punishment that produced nothing began to feel backward, and yet, the treadwheel did not vanish overnight. Some officials argued it still served a purpose, not economic, but moral. One warden of Brixton Prison declared proudly, in 1851, "The men on the wheel are quiet, they sleep soundly, they reflect. What more could one ask of justice?" The slow dismantling. It took nearly 50 years for the wheel to be fully removed from Britain's prisons. By 1898, the Prisons Act officially abolished treadwheel labour, declaring it inefficient and injurious. Most wheels were dismantled or repurposed, some as museum pieces, others as storage racks or scaffolding frames. But the discipline it represented did not disappear. It evolved. The same logic of routine, silence, and measurement reappeared in factory floors, schools, and barracks. The treadwheel had simply taught society how to organize time and obedience. In a way, its spirit lives on, not in wood and iron, but in the quiet expectation that work must fill every moment, even if that work serves no real purpose. The weight of repetition. If you could stand now in one of those empty treadwheel chambers, the boards gone soft with age, the air still thick with memory, you might still feel the rhythm beneath your feet. You might imagine the hundreds of men who climbed here, each step a mark of discipline, each drop of sweat a tiny tribute to a philosophy of order. Their labour was meant to reform them, but it also defined what Britain thought of as justice, measured, monotonous, and endlessly turning. To the reformers, this was moral science. To the prisoners, it was motion without meaning. And so the treadwheel stands in history not as a failure of technology, but as a mirror reflecting a time when the line between punishment and progress grew dangerously thin. The wheel slows, but does not stop. Its echo reaches across the decades, into modern prisons and modern workrooms, where repetition still masquerades as virtue. And somewhere in that echo lies a question: when labor becomes a rhythm, and rhythm becomes obedience, what remains of the person who walks? The treadwheel was built to last. Its thick oak beams, its iron supports, its steps worn smooth by countless boots, all crafted to endure years of motion. But nothing, not even punishment, can turn forever. By the late 19th century, the treadwheel had become both an embarrassment and a relic. Yet the world it helped create one, defined by discipline, schedules, and unrelenting routine, was only just beginning. The last wheels. In 1895, at Coldbath Fields Prison in London, a small group of prisoners still climbed the old wheel. The device had been modified over the decades, its rough edges replaced with smoother boards, its bars repainted. But its purpose had not changed. Inspector reports from that year noted, "The wheel continues to operate for 6 hours daily. Prisoners are in good order. Fatigue is moderate. The utility remains questionable." It was one of the final mentions of the treadwheel in official documents. Within 3 years, the Prisons Act of 1898 would formally abolish all forms of unproductive labor. By then, society had changed. Industrial Britain no longer needed men to mimic machines. Machines had learned to mimic men. Steam, electricity, and automation had replaced the human rhythm that once powered the empire. Yet for nearly 80 years, tens of thousands had walked those wooden steps, each footfall contributing to an invisible monument, a monument to obedience through monotony. When the last wheel stopped, few noticed. The prisons went silent, and the world outside kept moving. From labor to reform. The end of the treadwheel did not mean the end of prison labor, only a change in philosophy. The Victorian obsession with moral reformation through suffering gave way to the Edwardian ideal of rehabilitation through productivity. Work was still seen as redemptive, but now it was meant to teach a trade: shoemaking, tailoring, carpentry skills that might prepare prisoners for life after release. But the spirit of the wheel lingered. Schedules remained strict. Silence was still enforced. The concept of labor as the central tool of correction endured long into the 20th century, even as new machines appeared. Sewing machines, lathes, presses, the idea was the same. A controlled rhythm that shaped bodies and minds. The treadwheel had been crude, but its logic was modern. It trained an entire system to think of punishment as regimented time, a lesson that continues to echo in every institution built on control. The wheel as symbol. By the time the 20th century arrived, the treadwheel had taken on a new life, not as a tool of discipline, but as a symbol of monotony. Writers, philosophers, and reformers invoked it to describe modern existence itself. The poet Oscar Wilde, who spent time in Reading Gaol in the 1890 seconds, wrote of prison labor as motion without progress, a haunting metaphor for the human condition. Though Wilde did not walk the treadwheel, he described its spirit vividly. We sit, and the wheel turns, and the years go with it all, without meaning. In literature, the treadmill became shorthand for dull, repetitive labor, a word we still use today. Office life, bureaucracy, even daily routines, all described as the treadmill, echoes of Cubitt's invention 2 centuries later. What had once been a literal instrument of punishment became a metaphor for the quiet oppression of modern time. What it taught society. The treadwheel did more than punish criminals. It taught the world how to think about labor, control, and efficiency. When Sir William Cubitt designed it in 1818, his goal was not cruelty, but structure. He believed idleness was the root of vice, and that work, even meaningless work, could reform the soul. This belief merged seamlessly with the industrial mindset of the era. In factories, schools, and offices, repetition became a moral good. Productivity was measured not only in output, but in endurance. In that sense, the treadwheel was a prototype for the modern workday. It organized time into measurable units. It rewarded consistency over creativity. It separated labor from purpose. The prison wheel turned for decades, but its ideological rotation, the notion that one must always be working, always moving, continues to this day. When we speak of keeping busy or earning one's keep, we echo the very logic that built those prison machines. Human cost. It is easy, with distance, to see the treadwheel as a curiosity, an outdated mechanism of cruelty from a bygone age. But behind every rotation was a person. Archival records tell small, overlooked stories. Thomas B., age 17, sentenced to 3 months for stealing a loaf of bread. Released in poor condition, unable to walk steadily. Ellen P., one of the few women set to the smaller wheel at Brixton, suffered fainting and was removed to the infirmary. John H., a soldier turned deserter, worked the wheel for 8 hours a day in Woolwich Prison. His file notes: became listless, died in his cell. Cause: exhaustion. Their names are mostly forgotten. Their sweat soaked into wooden steps that no longer exist. And yet, their experience shaped an era's idea of justice, the belief that suffering could be mechanical, that the human spirit could be calibrated by discipline. The prison without walls. When the last wheels were dismantled, many found themselves wondering what, exactly, had been achieved. Had the prisoners truly been reformed? Did the endless labor of climbing wooden steps lead to moral insight, or simply exhaustion? In truth, the treadwheel reformed not the prisoner, but society's conscience. It allowed people to believe that punishment could be both humane and effective, that progress could be built on silence and motion. But as industrial society matured, this illusion faded. People began to see that machinery could imprison just as surely as it could liberate. Factories, time clocks, and strict work schedules replaced the treadwheel. New systems, same rhythm. The difference was that now everyone walked. The echo of the wheel today. If you visit the Prison Museum in York or the National Justice Museum in Nottingham, you can still see fragments of treadwheels preserved behind glass, wooden beams, iron bolts, a few steps worn smooth by years of climbing. Visitors look at them with mild curiosity. Children laugh and ask, did they really make people walk on that? But the guides, often former officers or historians, explain quietly that the wheel was not about walking. It was about time. Every minute on that machine was a minute owned by the state, counted and consumed. Every step was a measure of control. And when you leave the museum, step into the hum of traffic, the rhythm of engines and footsteps, it is hard not to notice that the wheel never really stopped turning. It simply changed shape. The quiet lesson. The treadwheel teaches an uncomfortable truth about civilization, that progress often disguises its cruelties as virtues. In its time, it was hailed as moral, efficient, and modern. Just as many of our systems are today, it promised redemption through labor and ended up producing despair. But there is also another lesson, hidden beneath the creaking boards and the enforced silence, a reminder of human endurance. For every man or woman who climbed that wheel, there was a heartbeat that refused to be mechanized, a mind that wandered beyond the walls, a thought, however fleeting, of freedom. They may have walked in circles, but their suffering traced a line through history, one that led to the eventual understanding that punishment, without purpose, is only cruelty, disguised as order. Reflection. As the treadwheel fades into memory, we are left to wonder, have we truly escaped its rhythm? Our days are filled with schedules, deadlines, and routines that turn endlessly, much like that old wooden machine. We move forward, or so we think, but often we are simply repeating the same steps, under different names. In a sense, we are all still walking the wheel, powered by time instead of timber, driven not by guards but by expectation. And yet, awareness itself is resistance. To remember, the treadwheel is to recognize when life begins to feel like one to step. Even briefly, off its endless turn, the wheel has stopped. The air is still. The footsteps fade into history, leaving only the quiet hum of progress and the uneasy question it carries still. When the work never ends, is it punishment or civilization? You stand in the half-dark of a medieval city, perhaps London, around the year 1350. The air smells of wood smoke and tallow, of damp stone and spilled ale. But beneath those familiar odours lies something else. A stench so thick and sour, it clings to your throat. It comes from below. Beneath the houses and taverns, in the shadowed spaces between walls, are cesspits deep. Brick-lined holes where the waste of hundreds collects. Every street has them. Every home contributes. And every night, when the city sleeps, a small band of men climb down into those pits to clean them. They are called gong farmers, from the Old English word gang, meaning to go. They are the men who deal with what everyone else prefers to ignore. This is their world, the city's hidden problem. In the Middle Ages, sanitation was a constant concern, though rarely an open topic. Cities grew fast, houses were built close, and sewage systems as we know them today did not exist. Each building had a privy, usually a small wooden shed, over a pit. Wealthy homes had brick or stone-lined cesspits, sometimes shared with neighbours. The poor simply used ditches or buckets. Once a cesspit filled, it had to be emptied, otherwise it would overflow into streets or wells. The liquid waste, known as night soil, could seep through foundations or drain into the Thames. Thus, by necessity, the gong farmers existed. They were hired to remove human waste by hand, bucket by bucket, usually under cover of darkness. The job was so filthy, so dangerous, and so vital that it formed a cornerstone of medieval urban life. The men who went below, gong farmers, were not slaves nor prisoners. They were labourers, sometimes even well-paid ones. City regulations often restricted their work to the hours between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. to avoid offending the public. During those hours, they climbed into cesspits as deep as 20 feet, using ladders, ropes, and candles for light. With wooden shovels and iron scrapers, they filled barrels with night soil, hoisted them out, and carted the contents away, usually to the outskirts of town, where it could be dumped or sold as fertilizer. They wore thick leather aprons, long gloves if they could afford them, and rags around their mouths to soften the smell. Many worked in teams, taking turns below ground. The risk was real. Methane gas could ignite from a single candle spark. Cesspits sometimes collapsed, suffocating or drowning those inside. One 14th century record tells of a gong farmer in York who was overcome by foul air and perished in the pit, none daring to descend for him. Another account, from London in 1326, describes a man found up to his chest in filth, the ladder broken, his cries unheard until dawn. They were quite literally the unseen foundation of city sanitation, dying so others could breathe. The stench and the stigma. No one wanted to live near them. Gong farmers were forbidden from living inside city walls in many towns. In London, they were confined to the outskirts, particularly Farringdon, without near what would later become Clerkenwell. The law also required them to work only at night, to avoid offence to the king's people. They were banned from entering taverns while in their work clothes, and any gong farmer found walking the streets by day, reeking of his trade, could be fined or beaten. Despite this, their wages were relatively high, sometimes 6 pence a night, far more than an ordinary labourer earned. In a world where survival depended on any income, some accepted the shame for the sake of coin. The city needed them, but pretended not to. The work itself. Picture it. A man with a rope tied around his waist, lowering himself into a hole no wider than a doorway. The air below is thick and humid. He moves slowly, scraping the walls and shoveling into a bucket. The bucket is hauled up by his partner, who empties it into a cart. The process repeats until dawn. Sometimes the waste was taken to lay stalls, open dumping grounds outside the city, but much of it was resold. Farmers knew that decomposed night soil made excellent fertilizer. In fact, entire trades developed around its reuse. Nightmen transported it. Muck spreaders applied it to fields. It was the recycling system of its day, centuries before the term existed. And yet, for all its utility, the work was invisible. Few chroniclers mentioned gong farmers, except in disgust or mockery. Plays and poems of the time used them as symbols of filth and moral decay. Even Chaucer, in his Canterbury Tales, refers to them briefly as figures of comic revulsion. They were indispensable, but untouchable, the smell of survival. Despite the stigma, the gong farmers' work could bring small advantages. Some found a strange sense of autonomy in it. No overseers, no guild masters, no noble patrons to please. Their work was simple. Remove the waste, get paid, and disappear before sunrise. Some even grew wealthy. In the 16th century, records from York mention a gong farmer named Richard the Dungman, who owned 2 horses and a cart, and rented out his services to several parishes. Another, in Nottingham, left enough money upon his death to build a small chapel, a rare act of charity from a man most would not shake hands with. There is irony here. The men most despised for their trade were among the few who truly understood how the city worked. They knew its hidden layers, its underground arteries, the soft spots in its foundations. They moved through the waste of society, unseen, essential, and enduring. Night in the city. If you could walk through London at midnight in 1350, you might hear the rumble of wooden wheels over cobblestone. Lanterns flicker. A team of gong farmers passes, pushing carts of sealed barrels toward the gates. The streets are quiet, except for their footsteps. The taverns are dark. The air is cold. But behind closed doors, the city's thousands sleep peacefully. Their waste already gone. The smell already fading. Tomorrow, the same cycle begins again. Each night, the gong farmers descend into the dark, cleaning what must be cleaned, unseen by the people who rely on them most. It is not glory that drives them, but necessity, the simplest form of human resilience. The medieval city could not exist without them, yet they were never celebrated, never welcomed, never remembered. Their story is one of invisibility of survival through the worst of work, and of how civilization depends most on those it chooses to forget. But even among these men of muck and shadow, there were hierarchies, fortunes, and tragedies to be told. Because where there is waste, there is also power. When survival itself smells foul, how much dignity can a man afford to lose? By nightfall, the city above is quiet, its streets deserted, except for the occasional watchman or drunk wandering home. But beneath, in the darkened cesspits and labyrinths of wooden gutters, the gong farmers move with purpose. Their work is no longer just about removal. It is about value. Human waste, once considered merely foul, has become a commodity. The economics of night soil. It is easy to imagine medieval waste as only a nuisance, but in reality, night soil was a precious resource. The fertility of farmland depended on it. Villages outside the city, with soil exhausted by centuries of cropping, relied on the barrels of excrement carted from town. Farmers paid well for this material, far more than they might for manure gathered locally. In London, one record from 1402 notes that a cartload of human waste could fetch twice the price of a cowhide. The richer the district, the richer the gold beneath their floors. Gong farmers, therefore, were not merely scavengers. They were middlemen in a hidden economy. By collecting and selling night soil, they became small entrepreneurs. Those who worked efficiently could hire extra hands, expand routes, and establish contracts with multiple parishes. It was dangerous work, but profitable, at least for a few. Techniques of collection efficiency mattered. The best gong farmers developed systems to maximize output and minimize risk. They learned the geometry of cesspits, the angle of the walls, the depth of the sediment, the timing for when waste could be easily scooped. Some used poles and hooks to break up compacted matter before shoveling. Buckets were often lined with straw to absorb liquids and prevent spills. Others preferred barrels with tight lids, reducing the stench on the journey back through narrow streets. Candles and torches were essential but hazardous. Methane accumulation was a real danger. A single flame could ignite the pit and kill the men below. Experienced workers would light their torches carefully, placing straw shields or creating small ventilating shafts to allow the gas to escape. Some gong farmers carried special knives or hooks to remove debris that could clog the barrels. Broken pottery, animal bones, or even the occasional coin dropped into the pit by careless residents. They became skilled at navigating the darkness, the stench, and the dangers that lurked in the bowels of the city. Their work required muscle, endurance, and strategy, yet little else in the way of formal education. The social hierarchy of filth. Not all gong farmers were equal. The trade had its own hierarchies and reputations. Some were known as first-class nightmen, trusted with the wealthier districts, where barrels of excrement could be sold for higher prices. They managed teams, assigned routes, and negotiated deals with farmers. Others worked in poorer districts or in smaller towns, dealing with more hazardous conditions and less pay. Their labor was relentless but unrewarding. Records show that disputes over routes could turn violent. A particularly lucrative cesspit might spark arguments between workers, sometimes requiring intervention by local magistrates. In extreme cases, it was said, gangs of young men would follow a wealthy district at night, attempting to steal barrels from the main collectors. Such thefts could be fatal. The night soil was heavy, the streets dark, and accidents common. Despite the stigma, some gong farmers gained respect, not from the citizens who avoided them, but from each other. Their knowledge of the city's hidden infrastructure was unmatched. They knew which cesspits were the deepest, which ones overflowed fastest, and which streets were safest to move barrels through in the dead of night. Life, above ground. Although their work was underground, gong farmers were not entirely cut off from society. They often lived in small, humble dwellings on the edge of the city. Because of the smell associated with their trade, many were forbidden from entering the city's main districts during the day. This forced them to create tight-knit communities on the margins, where they shared resources, knowledge, and gossip. During daylight, they rested, repaired tools, and sometimes cultivated small gardens to supplement their meager wages. Children might accompany parents on lighter tasks, learning the trade from an early age. Apprenticeships were common, not formalized by guilds, but passed down within families. In a sense, gong farmers were a subterranean guild, connected by work, secrecy, and survival, rather than social recognition. The health risks. It is impossible to overstate the dangers of the job, beyond methane and collapsing pits. Disease was rampant. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid all thrived in the conditions gong farmers faced daily. They had no protective masks, no antiseptics, no knowledge of germs. A small cut could become infected. A single exposure could be fatal. Yet many endured. They developed crude rituals to survive. Some coated their hands and arms with lime to reduce smell and bacteria. Others carried herbs to mask odors or to purify the air. One 15th century manuscript notes, "The nightmen of London smell of death yet breathe still. They endure what few would, and in their courage lie the city's safety." It is remarkable, when you think of it, that the very foundations of medieval urban life depended on men willing to descend nightly into disease and stench, doing work no one else dared contemplate, fortune amid filth. Despite the hazards and stigma, some gong farmers prospered. The most enterprising created networks of collection and delivery. They purchased carts, hired assistants, and negotiated contracts that guaranteed income for months in advance. In certain regions, their knowledge even allowed them to profit from treasure. Coins, rings, or valuable items sometimes fell into privies, a rare windfall for the attentive nightman. Chroniclers occasionally mention gong farmers leaving bequests in their wills, using wealth accumulated from gold beneath the dung to purchase land, marry well, or provide for their families. It was a strange form of upward mobility. The very thing society scorned, human excrement, became the source of their small fortunes. The invisible backbone cities could not function without the gong farmers. Wealthy nobles, merchants, and commoners alike relied on their labor, yet few acknowledged it. The irony is profound. The people most essential to public health were also the most invisible, forced to the margins both physically and socially. Without gong farmers, wells would have fouled, streets would have overflowed, and disease would have spread, even more violently. They were the silent backbone of urban survival, enduring night after night of the worst human conditions imaginable. And yet, for all their importance, history rarely remembers them. Their names are mostly lost, their graves unmarked, their labor erased from the city's story, a glimpse of humanity. Despite the filth, the work also reveals a surprising humanity. Gong farmers often developed close bonds with their apprentices and colleagues. In the darkness of cesspits, they shared stories, songs, and even humor. A joke, a whispered warning, or a shared meal became acts of defiance against the overwhelming unpleasantness of their environment. Some kept diaries, recording weather, routes, and observations of the city above. Others memorized the layout of pipes and pits, creating oral maps that allowed their successors to work more safely. It was not simply labor, it was knowledge passed down, a form of survival intelligence. The city sleeps above, ignorant of the sacrifices beneath its feet. The nightmen rise before dawn, hauling their barrels through empty streets, leaving no trace but faint footprints and the faint echo of human endurance. They are unseen, uncelebrated, and essential. And yet, within their story lies a quiet lesson about resilience, about how civilization often depends on those willing to do the work, others refuse, and how dignity can persist even in the most degrading of circumstances. The cesspits wait for nightfall. The lanterns will be lit. The gong farmers will descend once more, and the cycle will continue, because cities cannot survive without the labor of those who endure what everyone else avoids. The smell, the darkness, the danger, it is all part of survival. And yet, even in filth, there is fortune. The night is nearly over. The streets above are still. The merchants' shutters down. The taverns empty. But below, the work is ending for now. The last barrels are hoisted, the final scraps scraped from the pits. The city above will awaken, oblivious to the night's labor. And yet, in that unseen toil lies a story of endurance, adaptation, and unexpected influence on the course of urban history. The dawn of recognition. By the late 15th century, some city officials began to realize the value of their night workers. In London, the mayor and aldermen enacted regulations formalizing the gong farmer trade, specifying hours of work, routes, and safety requirements, licensing nightmen to prevent fraud or theft of barrels, ensuring payment agreements for delivery to farms or lay stalls. Though still stigmatized, the role gained official recognition, and some families of gong farmers became known entities in local records. In York, guilds of related trades began to interact with nightmen, carpenters who repaired privies, masons who lined cesspits, cartwrights who maintained the barrel's wheels. The gong farmers were still marginalized, but they were part of a web of urban labor that made the city function. This is an important point. Survival and invisibility do not mean irrelevance. The men who walked in filth had power, subtle, structural power over the city's health, commerce, and growth. Filth as fertility. Human waste, once removed, rarely went to waste entirely. Farmers outside the city prized it as fertilizer. Rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, night soil rejuvenated, depleted fields, and allowed crops to flourish. Records from the 16th century indicate that certain districts became known for the quality of their soil contributions, increasing demand for particular gong farmers' services. Some even became semi-wealthy, their small fortunes rooted in the very waste the city abhorred. In essence, the labor of removing the city's filth fed the rural economy, supported trade, and indirectly sustained urban populations by improving agricultural yield. The gong farmers, through their grim work, became connectors between city and the countryside, the hidden veins through which life itself flowed. The risks persist. Yet for all its utility and recognition, the work remained deadly. Gas explosions were a persistent hazard. Collapse of wooden pit walls continued to claim lives. Disease, always lurking, remained the primary threat. Typhoid, dysentery, and cholera could strike swiftly, claiming workers who had spent countless nights exposed to concentrated human waste. 1524 city record from London notes. A nightman named William of Farringdon fell ill after a week of heavy labour in unventilated pits. He died before the 7th day. Such incidents were tragic but unsurprising. In an era before germ theory, precautions were limited to rudimentary gloves, lime, and incense. Survival depended largely on luck, endurance, and knowledge of the pit's quirks. Humour and humanity, underground. Despite the dangers, human resilience persisted. Gong farmers were known to use humour as a coping mechanism. Lantern-lit cesspits echoed with quiet jokes, nicknames, and whispered stories. Some kept small charms or amulets against disease. Others sang hymns or prayers for protection, blending superstition with practical knowledge. These rituals were not mere folly, they were mental survival strategies, a way to maintain composure while facing conditions that could break body and spirit alike. The camaraderie formed in darkness became as vital as the tools in their hands. Apprentices learned not only how to shovel efficiently, but also how to navigate the dangers of hierarchy, collapse, and disease. In this sense, the gong farmer trade was more than labor. It was an early form of apprenticeship, survival education, and community building. In one of the most challenging environments imaginable, the transformation of urban sanitation. By the 17th century, urban sanitation began to improve. Cities grew larger, and engineers began planning rudimentary sewer systems, covered drains that carried waste away from homes into rivers or designated dumping grounds. This reduced dependence on individual cesspit cleaners, but it did not eliminate the role of the gong farmer entirely.